I'm here today with Jim Mellon, investor, very good investor, and author. His new book, Fast Forward, is just out, and we've written about it in the magazine. I think many of you may have it already, but today we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the themes inside it. Before we do that, Jim, though, I just want to talk a little bit about the markets in general. We're talking just as the ruble has really, really collapsed, and you have some experience in Russia. And I know that last month you told your readers to not invest in Russia, in fact, not to touch it with a barge top. Have your views changed at all now that it's really collapsed?
Well, it's like catching a falling knife, isn't it? And sort of a lot of people have been wallpapered in the last couple of days with Russian paper. But I think it's getting very close to a climactic moment. But they'll impose capital controls in Russia. I'm absolutely certain of that. So that may stabilize the euro, but it means that if you buy, if you buy the ruble, are you going to be able to trade it freely? I don't know. But I would, in fact, one of my recommendations is to, as a sort of bonus lotto recommendation, is to buy Gazprom ADRs, because Gazprom is producing 3 times more gas than it did in 2003. The price is twice as high as it was in 2003, despite everything, and the share price is exactly the same as it was in 2003. So it's 2 times earnings. It's got a dividend yield of about 5 or 6%, so it might just be worth a punt.
Okay, so it's so cheap.
Exactly.
That you just might as well.
And it's the world's biggest producer of gas. Okay. And Russia's basically a petrol station with everyone else living off the proceeds, and which is its problem, basically. But the danger is, I think the danger is that the general population in Russia is now really scared, and it reminds me of 1998 when I lost an absolute fortune in Russia.
And that's why I thought you might have something.
So anything I do will be very cautious. Right? I don't want to lose all my money all again, basically, and get margin calls in the middle of the night.
But the capital controls issue is a tricky one, because if you do invest in Russia, not just in the currency but in the stock market, once you're in, you may not be able to get out.
Well, except the ADR is traded in the US, and it's about, if I remember right, it's about $7 an ADR. So it's very cheap relative to where it's been. I think it's been as high as $30 or something. So might be interesting.
And when we last talked, moving away from the misery of Russia for a minute, when we last talked, your favourite market was Japan.
Yes.
Still there?
I don't actually have anything in the Nikkei at the moment, but I still think it's going to go up. I mean, it's had for some reason, it's really stalled in the last couple of days. But I think that the Nikkei's got 20,000 written all over it, and 16,500 today, so why wouldn't you buy it? I guess there's a lot of uncertainty in Japan post the election, the most recent election, and the economy's still not got traction. But I've just been in Japan, and I felt that, I mean, I know you go to Japan quite often. I felt that it's not nearly as dire as people might like to portray.
But I never feel it's as dire as people might portray. And all the way through the Great Depression, Japan has felt absolutely fine.
Yeah.
When you've gone there, and now it feels even more than fine. It feels great. But then, of course, we tend to go to the big cities, don't we? So we don't necessarily
see what's happening.
Feel outside that.
Yeah, that's true. But I don't think the yen needs to go any lower, because 30% of Japanese production is outside of Japan. Their price elasticity on their exports is not very high, because they're highly sophisticated manufactured goods. So I don't think the yen needs to go any lower for the Japanese to be very competitive in export markets. So I wouldn't necessarily hedge the yen anymore. I'd leave that unhedged, but I'd buy the Nikkei. And I was looking at Honda today, which is having problems because of this airbag issue in America. And it's 9 times earnings, it's stuffed full of cash, it's making 4 million cars a year. It's a very good company. I mean, why wouldn't you buy that? It's got a 3% dividend yield, and the Japanese government bonds are yielding 0.3%. So if you're a Japanese investor, wouldn't you want to trade government bonds which are uncertain, I would have thought, given the lack of credit suitability of Japan, and buy the stocks when everything's going for stocks? My general view is buy Japan.
Buy Japan.
Much more than buy the US.
Much more than buy Russia.
Well, Russia's a speculative punt, and I'm actually thinking about putting some money into Russia, but I'm still thinking. I'll let you know if I do it.
Let us know when you actually do it. And let us know when you go back into Japan properly as well.
Yeah. It'll be very, very soon.
And Europe, you've been very bearish on the euro for ages.
Yeah. I can't see any upside to the euro. I don't know about you, but if they do have a huge QE, which is most unlikely. I mean, the current attempt to add $1 trillion to the ECB balance sheet is pathetic. It's actually gone nowhere. It's like 100 or 200 million. It's nothing. And unless they go into buying sovereign bonds directly, then they're not going to do an effective QE. And even if
you think they won't do that?
I don't think they will, because the Germans just won't let them do it. And so if they don't do that, then it's even more disaster for the peripheral European countries. And by periphery, I include France in that now, because France is such a sort of lemming-like rush to the cliff. But and if they do it, then you're going to have all the consequences of massive QE, which is a depreciating currency. So I sense, as a trader, that the euro is about to have a little bounce to maybe 126 or 127, but my bet is it will be 110 by the end of next year.
Okay, so the trend is down, whatever happens.
Yeah, so it's 8.5% down so far this year, as of today, and I think another 10% down next year. So it's a great bet if you can short the euro. If you're a foreign exchange trader, it's the only one really that I see total clarity on.
So it's a brilliant trade on economic misery and deflation.
Yeah, and I don't see what the solution is. I mean, the only reason that you're getting current account surpluses in the peripheral countries is because domestic demand has collapsed. I don't think their balance sheet, the bank balance sheets, have been properly repaired. This latest asset quality review showed asset impairment on 48 billion out of, I think, 2 trillion of bank liabilities, or bank assets rather, which is pathetic really. And as our friend James Ferguson keeps on pointing out, you need 10 to 15% impairment to get the balance sheets right, and they've done about 2%. So nothing really looks good in Europe. But if the euro goes down to 110, then the exporters become viable, and they're cheap. The European stocks are cheap relative to other international markets. You might want to watch Germany.
Okay, so it's reasonable to expect the euro to go down, and as a result to buy cheap exporters in Germany.
This is a Japanese argument, really, isn't it?
Same as Japanese.
Yeah.
Of course, they're competing with each other, the German exporters and the Japanese exporters.
Well, to a certain extent. But in cars and in machinery, that's true. And actually, that's the other thing, is that the Chinese economy is definitely slowing faster than most people are saying.
Why do you think that? I mean, we would agree with you, but why do you think that?
I don't think it's just a thought. If you look at all the components of the Chinese economy, I mean, none of them seem to be growing, but they are still saying that they're growing at 7% a year, and I don't see how that's possible when the property market and construction, which is 1/3 of the economy, is in a dire recession, when the banks have got a lot of impaired loans, when the consumer is not spending. You see luxury goods going down, because especially the corruption crackdown. And exports are not really growing fast. So where is this growth coming from? Is the government spending a lot of money? I don't really think. It doesn't seem to be. So the figures are fictitious. I mean, what's the true growth in China? Maybe 4 or 5%, but that's not enough to be the motor of the exactly. So JP Morgan is saying that global growth this year is 2.5% in real terms. That's global growth, and next year will be 3%. But all brokering houses are going to say that it's going to be better next year. But my general impression will be worse next year.
So you add it all up. Where's it coming from?
Where's it coming from? And even the US, it's growing, but it's not gangbusters. And in Europe, it's zero growth. The emerging markets are really feeling the pain from the rising dollar and falling commodity prices. So China's not great. Japan's still flatlining. Where is this growth?
Well, that would make, we've looked at some of the cheap markets, but that would make the US market, on your estimation, hugely overpriced.
Well, I think we all agree on that. I mean, the US...
Well, I'm always looking for someone who might disagree. Someone must disagree because someone keeps buying it.
But in my recommendations today... They weren't very good last year, but hopefully it'll be better this year. I've got a US stock, Hewlett-Packard, which looks cheap to me for a variety of reasons, and it's a sort of old dinosaur. But everything that's growth-oriented is ridiculously overpriced. 100 times earnings, or not even earnings, basically. And I do not think those valuations, under any circumstances, can be justified.
Okay. Let's move away from the misery, go to the good stuff.
Yeah, okay.
Let's move on to the book, Fast Forward, and what it was that prompted you to write that.
Well, originally I was going to write about human redundancy, which is, the age of automation is going to make a whole load of people redundant, and that's still a thesis. But there was a couple of authors in the US that wrote exactly that book called The Second Machine Age, and so I was somewhat preempted in that.
It's very good, by the way.
It's very good.
Yours, I'm sure, would have been just as good, if not better.
But theirs is not an investment book. And so what we wanted to do was to show the positive aspects of technology and how you can actually make money out of it. And that's a difficulty because the investment in technology is very cartelized at the moment. In the Silicon Valley area, 40% of all the great companies that are called unicorns, which become $1 billion valuations, and normally they do it in 7 years, and normally the founders are not in their 20s but in their 30s, they come out of Silicon Valley. That's globally. Right, so that's 1/4 tenth of 1% of the world's population is producing 40% of the... And that's because all the venture capital companies are the same. They're the ones who seed these companies. And you've now got these large-scale basic technology trusts like Google or Facebook or Amazon or Alibaba in China, which any time there's anything good, buy it up for $1 or $2 billion.
You refer to these big companies now as technology trusts.
I do.
They're effectively buying up all the small companies with the good technology before anyone else gets a look in.
Exactly. And then the only time you see the opportunity for the retail investor or even the institutional investor is when they go out at fruity valuations in Alibaba type IPOs. And I'll give you an example in the Fast Forward book, which is now available in hardback because the publishing industry is so dinosaur, it takes a long time to come out, as you know. But having published books yourself, but I wrote about this company called Lift, which makes a spoon for Parkinson's disease people. So that if you've got Parkinson's disease, your hands in later stages go like this, and you can't eat because you can't get the food into your mouth. So they make a spoon that's got a gyroscope that basically, very sophisticated spoon that allows people to eat with Parkinson's disease. All right. So I write about this book, and guess who buys that company just a few weeks ago? Google. I mean, what's Google got to do with Parkinson's disease?
And they bought this before we even get the book.
They bought it before you've got the book. Well, you can get it on Kindle, of course. But so in other words, anything that's interesting is being snapped up. Now, that's not the case so much in life sciences, although I think it will become the case because Google's getting into it, and no doubt the rest of them will follow.
But does that make Google a buy?
I think if you want a very long-term sort of fund, admittedly it's not cheap, Google probably is the best buy. And, it's slightly scary, but they're still they've got the smartest people, and they have huge cash flow from their advertising business, so I can't see that being interrupted anytime very soon. So, they're the leaders in, if you want to be in, apart from Fujitsu Fanuc, or Fanuc as it's now called in Japan, they are the leaders in robotics. There is no other company that's really investable in robotics apart from them, KUKA and Fanuc in Japan. So the range of opportunity...
People just do not think of Google as a robotics company.
Well, they bought Boston Dynamics, which is probably the best robot company in the world. They're the leader in drone technology. They're doing all sorts of stuff in medicine. They've got the contact lens that measures your blood sugar. They're doing bioinformatics. I mean, they're not making any money off this stuff, but I think they start out with the premise that they don't really care if they make any money because they're making so much money elsewhere. They'll just find something that they can monetize in the future. And then the other ones are doing exactly the same. So the best virtual reality company, and virtual reality, by the way, will be a very big thing, is owned by Facebook.
Why will virtual reality be a very big
because
thing? Because the fit beyond games.
Because, for instance, if you want to, let's say you're buying a house, you'll be able to imagine that you'll be in an immersive experience inside the house at a remote distance through virtual reality. Not wearing one of these big clunky headsets. It's all going to become much, much more compact.
Are you saying that estate agents are going to become redundant?
Well, don't you think it's going to basically cut down the number of houses you actually go and see? So, when you're buying a house and everyone's seen, instead of seeing 100, you might just see 100 virtually and then go to the top 3, basically. So it's going to expedite the process. But that's just one example of it. But films will become immersive. Learning will become immersive. So it's going to be a much bigger industry than, for instance, doing operations will be done in virtual reality as well. I'm talking about surgical operations. And
go back to education, it'll become immersive, because you will do it from home, but you will be virtual realityed into a lecture hall.
Well, no, I think you'll do it in a classroom, but you'll be in a virtual reality space, and you'll be presented with various alternatives, which will be a way of challenging you, basically. I mean, I don't know, because I'm not in the education business, but it will become embedded in almost everything in the relatively near future. And most people don't even think about it. They think it's a sort of 1984 or Brave New World type thing. But it's here, and Facebook own it, which is, where's the opportunity for the rest of us, basically? So the same venture capitalists, the same companies, the same brokerage firms control a very large part of the future market. So what I was trying to do in this book is to write one that kind of obviates or helps the retail guy to get around this maze of cartelization that's producing very little opportunity for them.
And you did find some good companies that are available.
Yeah, we have a portfolio at the back, which I think will be a good one longer term. But some of the old dinosaurs may actually like Hewlett-Packard, may have something in them that could completely transform their growth prospects.
Okay, what does Hewlett-Packard have?
It has this thing called Merryn. And so if you take my iPhone here, this is 128 gigs, which is the most that you can get, I think, in an iPhone. But if I could put 100 terabytes onto that phone, I could record every moment of your life from the beginning of it to the end of it, and still have space to spare.
For you.
It would, but just to show that the Merryn gives the capability of compressing vast amounts of data in portable format, and Hewlett-Packard's the leader in that. And they're going to commercialize that in the next couple of years. I think it'll be enormous. So it's basically like flash memory, but an infinitely large amount. So instead of having the PC that you have in your office, you'll just have a little, effectively, USB stick that will carry everything. And so the other thing that's really interesting at the moment is the Internet of Things, which I know you've written about before. The Internet protocol that's just come into play will allow every single atom to have its own IP address, so that almost everything will be able to talk to everything else. So supply chains and industry, it's going to have a much bigger industrial application than consumer application to begin with. Everything in the retail space will communicate somehow or other with very, very powerful computers to make it more efficient. And
how's that going to change my life?
well, I guess it will reduce the cost of goods because they'll just become a much more efficient supply chain, basically.
Okay, so it's very deflationary what you're talking about here.
Well, yeah, it was good deflation. I mean, I don't think deflation's entirely bad. I mean, the idea that it's got to be terrible is just not true. And I was reading today that between 1830, and you know this already, in 1939, there were 50 years in which prices fell, and only 7 of those were recessionary years. So why does deflation have to be so terrible? And in fact, we've been experiencing deflation in many of the reason that you know that services go up in price every year, but the reason that prices overall don't go up a lot is because the price of this comes down, or the price of foodstuffs come down because of manufacturing efficiency, and that's deflation, but it's positive deflation.
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a terrible thing.
Unless you're very deeply in debt, and you quite wanted to inflate all that debt away.
Yeah,
in which case it suddenly becomes a very bad thing.
Well, we get back to Russia, and this is the big problem for Russia, is they've got $600 billion of imminently financeable or debt that needs to be refinanced, and how are they going to do it? Because it's in dollars.
Yeah.
I mean, basically the country's bust, and it's much worse than it was in 1998. So maybe there'll be some political solution. Maybe Vladimir Putin will be forced to kind of, come to an accommodation. That's the opportunity, but it's also the risk that, maybe these companies will just go bankrupt, and the Kremlin can't support them. So,
we were trying to get away from the bad news. we were heading for the good news.
So the good news is that basically, despite the Luddites in the world who are saying that, we're going to have, everyone's going to be out of a job, and by the way, it will be very disruptive. And I think the generation born in the 1980s are going to find it particularly hard, because they're a little bit too old to really embrace the modern technology and the changes that are happening.
Too young to have got out ahead with a final salary pension.
Exactly, and not just pension, but to get in. I mean, I'm sure you know lots of people who are in their 20s and 30s who find it really hard to get on a proper career ladder. And also there's this horrible thing that every day in the newspaper there's someone who's just become a billionaire at the age of 20 or 30, and when we were that sort of well, you being much younger than me, but even in your time, the only way you could get rich was by being a rock star when you were in your 20s, and now it's sort of the role model is the Silicon Valley thing, but there are very few of them. I mean, they're very few.
They're very public, very
public, and it must make people in their 20s really frustrated about the fact they're in dead-end jobs working in Pret-a-Manger or whatever. I think that generation, to a large extent, is lost. But my real worry is in emerging markets, because this automation is going to take over every single task that can be done by human beings in a repetitive sense. And that's not just in factories. It's also in cleaning, it's in hospitals, it's in some caring industries, it's in fast food. That's what's going to happen. And even in fund management now, they're talking about basically this is going to be an automated process. And why not? Active managers don't make any money, or only 1 in 5 makes any alpha. So what happens in the emerging markets? Because the old story was you left the farm and you went to the factory and you made the cheap goods and they got sold to the West or to Japan. Now today, manufacturing in this era of abundance, capital abundance, is going to be localized. You can make the product much more cheaply with robots near the consumer than you don't have to have it made in China with long supply lines and quality issues
But
and all that sort of
this
stuff.
is nice for developed nations because it's reassuring. It brings some of the jobs back, or certainly the knowledge jobs back.
It does, but then think about Africa, right? So how are they going to support what will be 4.5 billion people in 2100, up from 1 billion today at the current rates of population growth? Nigeria, which in 1960 had 48 million people at independence, is going to 1 billion people on its own in 2100. So what's going to happen? How are they going to have jobs? Because the old model is broken. And we in the West, yes, I think we're in a strong position. Because first of all, we have a very low fertility rate, and therefore populations are not expanding. We can probably find jobs for the people in our societies, or even sort of quasi non-jobs. And we are the most advanced in terms of automation. But it is an absolute fact that almost everything, there's a thing called Amelia, which has been developed by SciSoft, and Amelia will replace all PAs in the next 10 or 15 years, because she learns from all her mistakes. She works 24 hours a day. She doesn't need to be paid once you've paid the license.
And finally, those of us who don't have a PA will have a PA.
You probably, I mean, in a way, you already have one. That's this, isn't it? But
Doesn't
Amelia
work
will
very
just
well.
organise everything for you. Okay, but you know, and so what? Already in the US in the last 10 years, there's been 600,000 secretarial or PA jobs that have been lost. So if you ask me, what are the industries that are going to be job productive? I would say the artisanal industries. So the ones where, I'm not talking about making baskets and stuff like that, but where you're making highly crafted stuff using technology. So maybe, for instance, personalized knife sets. I was reading about this company in the US that makes these really amazing knives, and they're made to specification and to order. So the artisanal industries are growing in the United States, which is the model for everything, really. The caring industries, I think, will be enormous as the population ages,
Yeah.
and we don't want to be cared for necessarily by robots for the rest of our lives, although there will be an element of robotic stuff. And then you've got the IT industry, which is, if you're actually a young person, this book is really designed for parents to give to their teenagers to think about what's happening in the world.
So what do we teach our children? What's the most important thing for my children to learn at school so they can survive in this new world of automation?
Well, I think you don't do
Not
what
just
mummy,
survive, but prosper.
You don't do what mummy and daddy did. So the old model of going into accounting, the law, being a doctor, having a sort of professional job is broken. And I think you have to be IT savvy. I'm not talking about internet savvy, but IT savvy is really important. And be very flexible in your approach. I mean, everything is changing so quickly that I don't know what's going to be big in 5 years' time, but you just have to be very opportunistic in what you're going to do.
Languages, do I have to bother teaching the children Mandarin?
No, they can do it all
Mandarin?
on Duolingo, basically, if
Okay.
they want to,
So
or
no-
Google Translation.
No need for second languages. Coding, or will most of the coding be done by a computer too?
Well, exactly, and people are doing these coding schools and, sending their kids to it, but actually that's like sending kids to clerical school 50 years ago. Do you want them to be a clerk sort of sitting there doing coding? No. Use the coders to get where you want. So what are going to be the future industries? Well, I try and lay them out, but the energy industry in its various forms is going to be a big one. The transportation industry is really reforming very quickly, and I'm not just talking about driverless cars. I'm talking about railways and space travel is very interesting. New materials, so graphene you've written about many times, but there are many other new materials that are of very great interest, and payment systems. What's going to happen to the banks? I don't know, but they're not going to be like
Nothing
they are
good.
today. Nothing
Yeah.
good. So there's lots of opportunity there. And what I was basically trying to do is to distill all the stuff that we already know in vague terms into something that's both condensed, hopefully readable, and also has some investment portion to it. Because if you invest in the status quo today, as we all know, you're going to be toast.
Okay, there's a portfolio in the back of the book.
There is, yeah.
Give us your favourite chip in it. Number one stock.
Well, I think
for the
I mean,
punters out there.
Well, I think basically you just buy Google as a long-term investment. I mean, I hate to say it because it's already a huge company, and it's probably only going to grow by 10 to 15%. But if you want all the key components, it's in that.
That's the one to get.
Yeah,
Okay.
at least at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jim.
I'm anticipating that there's going to be a run on cash, that people are going to want real cash. And by real cash, I mean dollars.
You mean actual notes?
Pieces of paper.
Actual notes.
Pieces of paper, because the whole economy works on credit.